Essay 2 from Sex Memos for the Next Millennium by Italo Calvino. Quickness. I'll start by telling you an old legend. Late in life, the Emperor Charlemagne fell in love with a German girl. The court barons were dismayed to see that their sovereign, overcome by ardent desire and forgetful of royal dignity, was neglecting imperial affairs. When the girl suddenly died, the dignitaries sighed with relief, but only briefly, for Charlemagne's love did not die with the girl. The emperor had the embalmed body brought to his chamber and refused to leave its side. Archbishop Turpin, alarmed by this morbid passion and suspecting some enchantment, decided to examine the corpse. Hidden beneath the dead tongue, he found a gemstone ring. As soon as he took possession of it, Charlemagne hastened to have the corpse buried and directed his love toward the person of the archbishop. To extricate himself from that awkward situation, Turpin threw the ring into Lake Constance. Charlemagne fell in love with the lake and refused to leave its shores. This legend, quote, taken from a book on magic, unquote, is recounted even more tersely than I have done here in an unpublished notebook by the French romantic writer Barbey d'Aurevilly. It can be found in the Pléiade edition of his works, Volume 1, page 1315. Ever since I read it, my mind has kept returning to it, as if the ring's enchantment were still exerting its pull through the story. Let's try to figure out why a story like this one fascinates us. We have a series of events, all of them unusual, that form a chain: an old man's infatuation with a young girl, a necrophiliac obsession, a homosexual attraction, at the end of which everything subsides into melancholy and contemplation, the old king gazing raptly at the lake. Quote, Charlemagne, his gaze fixed on his Lake Constance, in love with the hidden abyss, unquote. Writes Barbey d'Aurevilly in the passage of the novel, Une vieille maîtresse, page 221, whose footnote refers us to this legend. The chain of events is linked by a verbal element, the word love or passion, which establishes a continuity among different kinds of attraction, and by a narrative element, the magic ring, which establishes a logical relation of cause and effect among the various episodes. The rush of desire toward an object that doesn't exist, an absence, a lack, symbolized by the empty circle of the ring, is created more by the rhythm of the story than by the events narrated. In the same way, the whole story is shot through with a feeling of death, against which Charlemagne desperately struggles, clinging to what links him to life, until his desperation subsides in contemplation of the lake. The story's true protagonist, however, is the magic ring, for it is the movement of the ring that dictates the movements of the characters and defines the relationships among them. Around the magic object there forms a kind of force field, which is the field of the story. We might say the magic object is an outward sign that makes visible the links among characters and among events. A narrative function that goes back to Norse sagas and chivalric romances, and that continues to resurface in Italian Renaissance epics. In Orlando Furioso, we witness an endless series of exchanges of swords, shields, helmets, and horses, each endowed with particular properties, such that the plot can be described through changes in the properties of certain objects endowed with certain powers, which define the relations among certain characters. In realistic fiction, Mambrino's helmet can become a barber's basin, but it doesn't lose importance or meaning. Similarly, every object that Robinson Crusoe salvages from the wrecked ship or fashions with his own hands takes on crucial importance. We might say that as soon as an object appears in a narrative, it becomes charged with a special force, becomes like the pole in a magnetic field or a node in an invisible network of relations. The object's symbolic value can be explicit or not, but it is always present. We might even say that any object in a narrative is a magic object. But back to the legend of Charlemagne, which in Italian literature has a tradition behind it. In his Lettere Familiari, I-4, Petrarch describes how he heard this, quote, pleasing little tale, unquote, which he says he didn't believe while visiting Charlemagne's tomb in Aachen. In Petrarch's Latin, the story is much richer, both in sensory detail. The Bishop of Cologne, heeding a miraculous divine instruction, sticks a finger beneath the corpse's cold, stiff tongue, sub gelida requiescere liqua, and in moral commentary, but I find the bare-bones version in which everything is left to the imagination and the quickness of events creates a sense of inevitability much more powerful. Several versions of the legend appear with greater emphasis on the necrophiliac element. In the flowery Italian of the 16th century, Sebastiano Erizzo, a Venetian short story writer, has Charlemagne utter, while in bed with the corpse, a lamentation of several pages. On the other hand, his homosexual passion for the bishop is barely mentioned or even omitted, as in Giuseppe Bettusi's famous 16th century treatise on love, where the story ends with the discovery of the ring. And speaking of the ending, in Petrarch and his Italian followers, Lake Constance doesn't appear. The action is set entirely in Aachen, since the legend is meant to explain the origins of the palace and temple built there by the emperor. The ring gets tossed into a swamp, and he inhales the muddy stench like a perfume and, quote, delights in taking the waters. Details that recall other local legends about origins of thermal springs and that further emphasize the deathly mood of the whole. Earlier still were the medieval German traditions studied by Gaston Paris, in which Charlemagne's love for the dead woman is varied in ways that make it a very different story. Sometimes the beloved is the emperor's lawful wife, who uses the magic ring to ensure his fidelity. Sometimes she is a fairy or nymph who dies as soon as the ring is taken from her. Sometimes she is a woman who seems alive, but is revealed, once the ring is taken, to be a corpse. A Scandinavian saga is the likely source. The Norse king Harald sleeps with his dead wife, who is wrapped in a magic mantle that makes her seem alive. In short, the medieval versions collected by Gaston Paris lack the chain-like succession of events, and the literary versions by Petrarch and the Renaissance writers lack quickness. That's why I continue to prefer the version reported by Barbary d'Arville. Despite its coarse patchwork quality, its secret lies in its economy. Events, regardless of their duration, become like points connected by straight line segments in a zigzag fashion that suggests unceasing motion. I don't mean to say here that quickness has value in itself. Narrative time can also be delaying, cyclic, or static. In any case, a story is an operation on duration, an enchantment that affects the flow of time, contracting it or expanding it. Sicilian storytellers use the expression, quote, stories take no time, when they want to skip over things or indicate the passage of months or years. The craft of oral storytelling in the popular tradition is shaped by functional concerns. It omits pointless details and insists on repetition, as when, for example, a fable consists of obstacles that must be overcome. Part of a child's pleasure in listening to stories is in the anticipation of certain kinds of repetition. Situations, expressions, stock phrases. Just as rhythms help mark the rhythm of poems and songs, events can rhyme in prose narratives. The narrative of the Charlemagne legend works because there is a series of events that correspond like rhymes in a poem. If, during a certain period of my writing life, I was drawn to folk tales and fairy tales, it wasn't out of loyalty to some ethnic tradition. My roots are in a wholly modern cosmopolitan Italy. Nor out of nostalgia for the stories of my childhood. In my family, children read only educational science-based books. But rather out of my interest in their style and structure, in the economy, rhythm, and basic logic that govern their telling. As I worked to transcribe the Italian folktales taken down by 19th century scholars of folklore, I took special pleasure when the original texts were quite brief, and I, retelling them in my Fiabe Italiane, Italian Folktales, 1956, had to preserve their concision while trying to maximize their narrative power and poetic appeal. For example, Tale 57 begins like this. A king fell ill. The doctors came and said, "Listen, Majesty, if you want to get well, you have to get a feather from the ogre. That will be hard, since the ogre eats every soul he sees." The king spread the word, but no one wanted to go. He asked a retainer, who was very loyal and brave, and this man said, "I will go." They showed him the way. On top of a mountain are several caves. In one of the 7, the ogre lives. The man set out, and darkness overtook him along the way. He stopped at an inn, etc. Nothing is said about what illness the king suffered from, or how an ogre could possibly have feathers, or what those caves were like, but everything that is mentioned plays a necessary role in the plot. The chief characteristic of the folktale is economy of expression. The most extraordinary adventures are recounted in terms of their bare essentials. There is always a battle against time, against obstacles that impede or delay the achievement of a desire or the recovery of a lost possession. Time can be stopped completely, as in Sleeping Beauty's castle. All Charles Perrault has to do is to write, "Even the spits over the fire, laden with partridge and pheasant, went to sleep, and the fire slept too. It all happened in an instant. The fairies were not long in their labor." The relativity of time is an almost universal theme of folk tales. A journey to some faraway land seems to last only a few hours, yet the traveler returns to find the place he left unrecognizable, many years having passed. Here I might mention that in the early days of American literature, this motif gave rise to Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, which acquired the status of a foundation myth for your change-based society. This motif can also be understood as an allegory of narrative time, of its lack of correspondence to real time, and the same significance can be recognized in the opposite operation characteristic of Oriental storytelling, in which time expands by means of an internal proliferation from one story to another. Scheherazade tells a story in which someone tells a story in which someone tells a story, and so on. The art that allows Scheherazade to save her own life each night consists in knowing how to link one story to the other, and also how to break off at just the right time. Two operations on the continuity and discontinuity of time. It is a secret of rhythm, of mastering time, that we can trace to its origins, to the effects of meter in epic verse, and to the effects in prose narrative that makes us want to hear what happens next. Everyone knows how awkward it feels to hear someone who can't tell jokes try to tell one, only to spoil the effects, by which I mean, above all, the linkages and the rhythms. This feeling is evoked in one of Boccaccio's tales, 6, number 1, which is dedicated precisely to the art of oral storytelling. After dining as the guests of a Florentine lady at her country house, a cheerful group of knights and ladies set out on foot for another pleasant place in the area. To ease their journey, one of the men offers to tell a story. "Lady Oretta, if you wish, I could give you a ride for much of our remaining journey, a ride on the back of one of the finest tales in the world." To which the lady replied, "Sir, I beg you to do so. It would be a joy to me." Hearing this, the knight, who likely wore a sword at his side no better than a tail on his tongue, began to tell a story, which of itself was in fact quite fine, but by repeating the same word 3 or 4 or 6 times, or by backing up and sometimes saying, "I didn't say that well," or frequently getting names wrong, substituting one for another, he ruined it mercilessly. Aside from which, his delivery, given the nature of his characters and the events that were transpiring, was terrible. As a result, Lady Oretta, as she listened, often found herself in a sweat, her heart faltering, as if she were sick and nearing her end. Finally, unable to suffer the thing any longer, and seeing that the knight had gotten himself into a mess and was unlikely to get himself out of it, said pleasantly, "Sir, this horse of yours has too hard a trot, so I beg you to kindly set me back on my feet." The story is a horse, a means of transport, with a particular gait, trot or gallop, depending on the route to be traveled. And the speed at issue is a mental speed. The clumsy narrator's shortcomings, as enumerated by Boccaccio, are above all offenses against rhythm, but they are also defects of style, because the story's expressions are poorly suited to its characters and actions. It is clear then that even proper style requires a readiness to adapt, a nimbleness of expression and thought. The horse as emblem of mental speed has marked the whole history of literature, prefiguring the problems particular to our own technological situation. The era of speed in transportation, as in information, begins with one of the finest essays in English literature, The English Mail Coach by Thomas de Quincy, who in 1849 already understood everything we know today about the world of motors and highways, including fatal high-speed crashes. De Quincy describes a nighttime trip seated on the box of an extremely fast mail coach alongside a gigantic coachman who is fast asleep. The technical perfection of the vehicle, together with the driver's transformation into a blind, inanimate object, puts the traveler at the mercy of the inexorable exactitude of a machine. His senses heightened by a dose of laudanum, De Quincy realizes that the horses are running at a speed of 13 miles per hour on the wrong side of the road. This means certain disaster, not for the very fast and very bulky mail coach, but rather for the first unlucky carriage that happens along the same road in the opposite direction. And indeed, at the end of a straight, tree-lined avenue that resembles a cathedral nave, he sees a young couple approaching in a frail, reedy gig at 1 mile per hour. Between them and eternity, to all human calculation, there is but a minute and a half, De Quincy shouts. Mine had been the first step, the second was for the young man, the third was for God. The account of these few seconds remains unsurpassed, even in a period when the experience of high speeds has become a basic fact of human life. Glance of eye, thought of man, wing of angel, which of these had speed enough to sweep between the question and the answer and divide the one from the other? Light does not tread upon the steps of light more indivisibly than did all our conquering arrival upon the escaping efforts of the gig. De Quincy manages to convey the sense of an extremely brief span of time that nonetheless contains both the calculation of the technical inevitability of the crash and also of the incalculable God's part, thanks to which the two vehicles do not collide. What is of interest to us here is not the physical speed, but the relation between physical and mental speed. That relation was also of interest to the great Italian poet of De Quincey's generation, Giacomo Leopardi, who had an extraordinarily sedentary youth, described in an entry in his notebooks, the zibaldone of a rare moment of joy. Quote, the speed, for instance, of horses, whether imagined or experienced, that is, when they are carrying you, is enormously pleasurable in itself, because of the vividness, the energy, the strength, the life of such a sensation. It truly wakens something like an idea of the infinite. It exalts the mind, fortifies it. October 27, 1821. In the same notebooks, over the succeeding months, Leopardi developed his reflections on speed. At a certain point, he began discussing style. Quote, a quick, concise style is pleasing because it offers the mind a host of ideas simultaneously, or in such rapid succession that they appear simultaneous, staggering the mind with such an abundance of thoughts, or of psychic images and sensations that either it is unable to encompass all of them, and any of them fully, or it has no time to remain idle, empty of sensations. The power of poetic style, which is largely the same thing as quickness, is pleasing for such effects alone and consists of nothing else. The excitement of simultaneous ideas can derive from individual words, whether literal or metaphorical, from their arrangement, from a turn of phrase, and even from the suppression of other words and phrases, etc. November 3rd, 1821. The metaphor of the horse for speed of mind was, to my knowledge, first used by Galileo in Il Saggiatore, the Assayer, 1623. As he debated a rival who backed up his claims with many classical quotations, he wrote, if discoursing about a difficult problem were like carrying weights, where many horses can carry more sacks of grain than a single horse, I would agree that many discourses could do more than just one. But discoursing is like coursing, not like carrying, and one Barbary courser can outrun 100 Frisians. For Galileo, discoursing means reasoning, and often deductive reasoning. The statement discoursing is like coursing, il discorre e come il correre, could be his stylistic credo, style as method of thought and as literary taste. Quickness and nimbleness of thought, economy of argument, and also imaginative examples. For Galileo, these are the qualities crucial to good thinking. Galileo also demonstrates a fondness for horses in his metaphors and Gedankenexpressimenten. In a study I once did of his use of metaphor, I counted at least 11 notable examples in which he mentions horses as an image of movement, and thus as a tool for experiments in kinetics, as a form of nature in all its complexity and also all its beauty, as a form that sparks the imagination in scenarios where horses undergo the most unlikely trials or grow to enormous size, all in addition to his identification of reasoning with racing. Discoursing is like coursing. In Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi del mondo, dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, 1632, speed of thought is personified by Sagredo, a character who engages in discussions with the Ptolemaic Simplicio and the Copernican Salviati. Salviati and Sagredo represent two different facets of Galileo's personality. Salviati, the rigorous methodical reasoner, proceeds slowly and carefully. Sagredo, the characterized by his, quote, extremely rapid speech, unquote, and a much more imaginative spirit, has a tendency to draw unproven conclusions and to push every idea to its extreme, as when he speculates about what life might be like on the moon or what would happen if the earth stopped turning. It is Salviati, however, who defines the value system in which Galileo locates intellectual speed. The mind of God, he argues, reasons instantaneously, not by steps, and is thus infinitely superior to the human mind, which should not, however, be discounted or considered worthless, since it was created by God, and since it has, in its step-by-step fashion, understood and explored and accomplished marvelous things. At this point, Sagredo breaks in to praise the greatest human invention, the alphabet. But above all stupendous inventions, what eminence of mind was his who imagined he could find a way to communicate his inmost thoughts to any other person, even if separated by vast intervals of space and time. To speak with people in the Indies, to speak with those who are not yet born and will not be for 1,000 years or 10,000 years, and with such ease, all by the different arrangements of 20 little letters on a page. In my previous talk on lightness, I quoted Lucretius, who saw in the combinatorics of the alphabet a model for the intangible atomic structure of matter. Today I quote Galileo, who saw the permutations of the alphabet, quote, the different arrangements of 20 little letters, unquote, an unsurpassed tool of communication. Communication among people separated by space and time, he says, but one ought to add the immediate communication that writing establishes between every existent or possible thing. In each of these talks, I'm choosing a particular quality dear to my heart to recommend to the next millennium, and today the quality I want to recommend is this. In an age dominated by other media that are much faster and more pervasive, and that risk flattening all communication into a single homogeneous crust, the function of literature is to communicate among different things in terms of their differences, exalting rather than diminishing their differences, which is the proper role of written language. The motor age has turned speed into a measurable value, which speed records, marking the history of the progress of machines and men. But speed of mind cannot be measured and does not allow for comparisons or competitions, nor can its results be ranked to give historical perspective. Speed of mind is valuable in itself for the pleasure it gives those susceptible to such pleasure, not for any practical use that it can be put to. Fast thinking is not necessarily better than considered thinking, far from it, but it conveys something special that has to do specifically with its swiftness. The qualities I've chosen as subjects for these lectures do not, as I said at the start, exclude their opposite qualities. Just as my respect for weight was implicit in my praise of lightness, so this defense of quickness does not presume to deny the pleasures of delay. Literature has developed various strategies for slowing the flow of time. I have already mentioned repetition, and now I should say a word about digression. In real life, time is a resource we are stingy with. In literature, time is a resource to be disposed of in a casual, leisurely fashion. It's not a question of crossing some finish line first. On the other hand, being thrifty with time is a good thing, since the more time we save, the more time we'll be able to lose. Quickness of style and thought means above all nimbleness, mobility, and ease, all qualities that go with writing that is prone to digression, to leaping from one topic to another, to losing the thread 100 times and finding it again after 100 twists and turns. Lawrence Stern's great invention was a novel composed entirely of digressions, an example soon followed by Diderot. The divagation or digression is a way to postpone the ending, a proliferation of the internal time of a work, a perpetual attempt to escape. But to escape from what? From death, of course, according to an introduction to Tristram Shandy written by the Italian writer Carlo Levi, whom few could have pegged as a stern admirer. Levi's secret, however, was to bring precisely that digressive spirit and sense of limitless time to the examination of social problems. He writes, quote, The clock is Shandy's first symbol. Under its influence, he conceived and his misfortunes begin, which are the same thing according to this sign of time. Death is hidden in clocks, as Belly said, along with the unhappiness of individual life, of this fragment, of this thing that is divided, disintegrated, deprived of wholeness. Death, which is time, the time of individuation, of separation, the abstract time that rolls toward its end. Tristram Shandy doesn't want to be born because he doesn't want to die. Any means, any weapon can be used to save oneself from death and time. If a straight line is the shortest distance between two fatal, inescapable points, then digressions lengthen that line. And if these digressions become so complex, tangled, tortuous, and so rapid as to obscure their own tracks, then perhaps death won't find us again. Perhaps time will lose its way. Perhaps we'll be able to remain concealed in our ever-changing hiding places. Unquote. These are words that give me pause, because I am not a devotee of digression. I might say I prefer to entrust myself to the straight line in hopes that it will continue on into infinity and make me unreachable. I prefer to carefully calculate my escape trajectory, eager to launch myself like an arrow and disappear over the horizon. Or, if too many obstacles block my path, to calculate the series of straight segments that will get me out of the labyrinth as soon as possible. In my youth, I chose as my motto the ancient Latin maxim, festina lente, make haste slowly. Perhaps what attracted me even more than the words or the idea were its evocative emblems. You may recall the title pages of Aldus Manutius and the great Venetian humanist and publisher, on which the motto festina lente was symbolized by a dolphin snaking around the shank of an anchor. The elegant printer's mark, about which Erasmus wrote some memorable pages, suggests the intensity and tenacity of the intellectual labor. But both dolphin and anchor belong to the realm of marine imagery, while I have always preferred emblems that, like a rebus, combine incongruous enigmatic figures, such as the butterfly and the crab, with which Paolo Giovio illustrated festina lente in his 16th century collection of emblems, two animal shapes, both bizarre, both symmetrical, that create between themselves an unexpected harmony. From its beginnings, my work as a writer has aimed to follow the lightning-fast course of mental circuits that capture and link points that are far apart in space and time. In my fondness for adventure stories and fairy tales, I have always sought something like an inner energy, a motion of the mind. I have focused on the image and on the motion that springs naturally from the image, knowing all the while that one cannot speak of a literary result until this stream of imagination becomes words. As for the writer of verse, so for the writer of prose. Success is in the felicity of verbal expression, which can sometimes be achieved by a flash of inspiration, but which normally entails a patient search for the mot juste, for the sentence in which no word can be replaced, for the most efficient and semantically dense arrangements of sounds and ideas. I am convinced that writing prose should be no different than writing poetry. Both seek a mode of expression that is necessary, singular, dense, concise, and memorable. It is hard to maintain this kind of tension in very long works, and in any case, my temperament leads me to feel most at home in briefer pieces. My work consists largely of what you call short stories. For example, the kind of task I set myself in Cosmicomics 1965 and T Con Zero 1967 could work only within the brief span of a short story. And in Invisible Cities 1972, and now in the descriptions of Palomar, Mr. Palomar 1983, I've tried even shorter forms with even less narrative development, something between parables and prose poems. Of course, the length or brevity of a text is an external measure, but I'm referring to a particular density that, even if it can be also achieved in longer form narratives, nevertheless must be measured page by page. In this fondness for shorter forms, I am merely following the true inclination of Italian literature, which is poor in novelists, but always rich in poets, who, even when writing in prose, are at their best in texts where the heights of imagination and thought are contained in a few pages. Texts such as Leopardi's Operette Morali, Little Moral Works, which has no peer in other literatures. American literature has a glorious and still thriving tradition of short stories. Indeed, I would say that its crown jewels are among them. But the rigidly bipartisan taxonomy of publishers, either short stories or novels, leaves out other kinds of short forms, which nonetheless can be seen in the prose works of great American poets, from the specimen days of Walt Whitman to many pages of William Carlos Williams. The demands of the publishing marketplace are a fetish that should not prevent experimentation with new forms. I hope here to wave a flag for the richness of short forms with all they presuppose in terms of style and density of content. I'm thinking of Paul Valéry's Monsieur Test and many of his essays, of Francis Ponget's prose poems about objects, of Michael Learis's explorations of himself and his own language, and of the extremely brief stories of Henri Michaud's Plume with their mysterious and hallucinatory humor. The greatest new literary genre of our time was invented by a master of short forms, Jorge Luis Borges, when he invented himself as narrator, this being the egg of Columbus that enabled him to overcome the block which, until he was nearly 40, kept him from moving from essayistic prose to narrative prose. Borges' idea was to pretend that the book he wanted to write had already been written by someone else, some imaginary unknown author working in a different language, a different culture, and then to describe, summarize, and review that imaginary book. According to an anecdote that's now part of Borges' lore, when the first extraordinary story written along these lines, El Caminito al-Mutazim, the approach to al-Mutazim, appeared in the journal Sur in 1940, it was indeed believed to be a review of a book by an Indian author. Similarly, it has become obligatory among Borges' critics to observe that all his texts double or multiply their own space through other books, whether classical, scholarly, or simply invented, from real or imagined libraries. What I especially want to emphasize is the way Borges opens his windows onto the infinite without the slightest busyness, in a style that's utterly clear and sober and airy, as if telling stories through summaries and glimpses results in the most precise and concrete language, the inventiveness of which lies in its rhythmic variety, its syntactic movement, its unexpected and surprising adjectives. With Borges is born a literature raised to its square, and at the same time a literature that the extraction of its own square root, a potential literature, as it would be called later in France, but whose heralds may be found in fictiones, in cues and procedures of what might have been the words of an imaginary author called Herbert Quain. Concision is just one aspect of the subject I have chosen to discuss, and I'll restrict myself to telling you that I dream of encompassing vast cosmologies, sagas, and epics in the scope of an epigram. In the ever busier times that await us, literature will need to aim for the highest concentration of poetry and thought. Borges and Bioy Casares assembled an anthology called Short and Extraordinary Tales, 1955. I would like to put together a collection of stories consisting of a single sentence, or, if possible, a single line, but so far I haven't found any that surpass the one by the Guatemalan writer Augusto Monterroso. Quote, "When he awoke, the dinosaur was still there." Unquote. I realize that this lecture, based as it is on the inevitable connections, has branched out in various directions and risks seeming scattered. But all the topics I've discussed this evening, and maybe all those from my first talk, could be united under the sign of an Olympian I particularly revere, Hermes Mercury, god of communication and mediation, who, under the name of Thoth, invented writing, and who, as, quote, Spirit Mercury, unquote, also represents, as Carl Jung tells us in his work on alchemical symbolism, the principium individuationis, the principle of individualization. Mercury, with wings on his feet, light and airborne, clever and nimble, and adaptable and casual, establishes relations between one god and another, as well as relations between gods and men, between universal laws and individual cases, between natural forces and cultural forms, between all the world's objects and all its thinking subjects. What better patron could I choose for my literary proposal? Among the ancients who saw microcosm and macrocosm mirrored in the correspondences between psychology and astrology, between humors, temperaments, planets, constellations, Mercury's status was highly indefinite and variable. But according to the most widespread opinion, temperaments influenced by Mercury, with their knack for exchange and commerce, contrasted with temperaments influenced by Saturn, gloomy, contemplative, solitary. Since antiquity, Saturnine temperaments have been seen as characteristic of artists, poets, and thinkers, and I think there is truth in that view. Certainly literature would never have existed if some human beings had not been given to deep introversion, to dissatisfaction with the world as it is, to forgetting themselves for hours and days, their gaze fixed on mute, unmoving words. Certainly my own character shares some of the conventional traits of my trade. I too have always had a Saturnine disposition, whatever other mask I may have tried to wear. Perhaps my devotion to Mercury reveals an aspiration, a desire to be. I am a Saturnine man who wants to be mercurial, and everything I write shows traces of both impulses. But if Saturn Kronos does have some power over me, it is nonetheless true that I have never been devoted to him. I have never felt anything for him other than respectful fear. There is, though, another god related to Saturn by affinity and blood, for whom I have great affection, a god who, not having had one of the 7 planets of the ancient sky named after him, has not enjoyed as much astrological and therefore psychological prestige, but who has, on the other hand, enjoyed, ever since Homeric times, excellent literary fortunes. I am speaking of Vulcan, Hephaestus, who doesn't roam the skies, but rather holes up in craters, working tirelessly in his smithy to forge objects of great refinement, jewels and ornaments for the gods and goddesses, weapons, shields, nets, traps. In contrast to the soaring flight of Mercury, Vulcan offers his halting gait and his rhythmic hammer. Here, too, I must refer to something I happened to read, one of those books that seems, from an academic point of view, strange or hard to categorize, but that gives rise to clarifying ideas. The book in question, which I read when I was studying the symbolism of the tarot, is André Virel's Histoire de notre image, History of Our Image, 1965. According to de Virel, a student of the collective imagination in, I believe, the Jungian school, Mercury and Vulcan represent 2 inseparable and complementary functions of life. Mercury represents syntony, or harmonious participation in the world around us. Vulcan represents focalization, or constructive concentration. Mercury and Vulcan are both sons of Jupiter, whose realm is that of individual as well as social consciousness. But on his mother's side, Mercury is descended from Uranus, who ruled over the cyclophrenic age of undifferentiated continuity, while Vulcan descends from Saturn, who ruled over the schizophrenic age of egocentric isolation. Saturn had dethroned Uranus, Jupiter had dethroned Saturn, and in the end, in the stable and resplendent realm of Jupiter, both Mercury and Vulcan bear the memory of dark primordial realms, but transform their destructive maladies into positive qualities, syntony and focalization. When I read Varel's explanation of Mercury and Vulcan as both contrasting and complementary, I began to grasp something I had previously only vaguely intuited, something about myself, about how I am and how I wish to be, about how I write and how I might write. Vulcan's concentration and craftsmanship are necessary in order to write about Mercury's adventures and transformations. Mercury's mobility and swiftness are needed to imbue Vulcan's endless labors with meaning and to shape the shapeless minereal gange into attributes of the gods, lyres or tridents, spears or diadems. A writer's labor involves keeping track of different times. Mercury's time and Vulcan's time, a message of spontaneity obtained by means of patient, meticulous adjustments. A flash of insight that immediately takes on the finality of that which was inevitable, and also time that flows for no reason other than to allow feelings and thoughts to settle and ripen, unfettered by any impatience, any fleeting contingency. I began this talk by telling a story. Let me end it with another story, this one Chinese. Among Zhang Zhu's many virtues was his talent for drawing. The king asked him to draw a crab. Zhang Zhu said he would need 5 years and a villa with 12 servants. After 5 years, he had not yet begun the drawing. I need another 5 years, he said. The king agreed. When the 10th year was up, Zhang Zhu took his brush and in an instant, with a single flourish, drew a crab, the most perfect crab anyone had ever seen.